Thank you all again for coming. Thank you, Doris, for the introduction. Evolution is a difficult subject to talk about. It pushes many buttons. And thankfully, Theosophical Society is one of the safe places to criticize Darwin. Because Madame Blavatsky already did. So that is good. Because this is the last day, I don't want to start up too much controversy. But if you are not scared of saying negative things about Darwinism, it is very easy to say negative things about Darwinism, because Darwinism is not a very good theory. But one should always start with giving tribute to Darwin, because he did the best he could. At the time he discovered it, it's like all scientific discovery. At the time one begins the subject, it's very, very difficult. At that time, there was only one theory, a theory by a biologist named Lamarck, which just was not working. There was just not much evidential support for it. The idea is acquired characteristic. Somatic changes occur during people's lives, and then, like if we walk on very hilly terrain, then of course we develop a tough sole of the feet, and then maybe that is transmitted to our progenies, and that's how evolution occurs. That was Lamarck's idea. That was not all of his ideas, but that's what it sounds like in the beginning. And that just does not work very well. So Darwin thought that there has to be environmental changes during the whole geological age of the Earth. Very legitimate thinking. He also thought correctly that there has to be change in the species in order to adapt to the environmental changes. Again, very good thinking. And tremendous thinking, of course, is that there is a component, a biological component, that is inheritable. This was an original idea, pretty much. There was somebody else who suggested the same thing. And then he was a little stuck as to one component was finished. There is these variations that are going to take place in this component. We now call it gene. So gene variations, chance variations, mutations. But then what is the next decisive idea? And he was a bit stuck. He didn't know what happens after. Why is it that some variations stick and some variations don't stick? And then he read the paper by Malthus, which warned people of dangers of overpopulation. And immediately he had this. He writes it in his notebook. It's very interesting. When I was researching creativity, I read some of it. It's very interesting. He, right then and there, like an aha experience, he had the idea that, survival. Nature selects on the basis of survival. And Darwin's theory was born. So two components, genetic variations, nobody debates that, even today. Then another component, natural selection on the basis of survivability. And ever since it became a political issue. Survival of the fittest, so who is the fittest, and so forth. Huge politics. But even more politics came because there was already a theory of non-evolution in the Bible, and that became the huge problem. Part of the biblical position you already know. It is also very, very clear to every thinking person, and Darwin too. Darwin started his life as a clergyman, for God's sake. He knew that the world has to be purposive, and it is God's purpose playing out. Certainly he believed that for a long time. He sort of, under desperation, he formulated his theory. He was not very happy about it. He writes extensively that I'm not very happy that purpose is not included. He liked Lamarckian theory because it has purpose built into it. That he could never combine, he just could not combine. He struggled and struggled, could not combine the two theories in any way. So died a very frustrated man. The later thinkers of that era, they took up the battle with Christianity. The big idea, of course, of Christianity is that there got to be intelligent design. Now notice that this is a correct idea. Today it is also anathema because we just don't think about it anymore. We are so convinced by the media that Darwinism got to be the right answer. It agrees with all the experimental data. It doesn't. It blatantly doesn't. But you never hear that in the media. So it is because of the media that the ideas of design are rather muted. They're not publicized. People don't think about it anymore. And then, of course, the idea also of non-evolution. This is a literal interpretation of the Genesis. God created every creature at once. That seems to be the reading of the Genesis, obvious reading. And then, obviously, there is no evolution. And this theory cannot stand clearly because there is just enormous evidence, namely the fossil data, that species come, species go, species become extinct, new species arise at all times. There's no question about it. You can play sophistry. And this is the interesting thing. The Christians do it, creationists. They're wonderful sophistry, very good reading, by the way. If you're having difficulty in sleeping, read one of these books by Gish or somebody else. It's just wonderful how they justify Noah's Ark and everything. It's beautiful reading. I really enjoyed that part of my research. And but the funny thing is that the Darwinists do the same thing, sophistry. The Darwinian sophistry sounds a little more scientific. That's the only difference between the two. What is sophistry in science? Sophistry in science are those ideas which sounds very nice, but they can never be experimentally verified. Stephen Hawking is an artist in sophistry. He has given, this is a man, I have to say this, I mean, don't think of it as backbiting or anything. It's in good humor. This is a man who is a great mathematician, but he is famous as a physicist. What is the difference between mathematics and physics? In mathematics, we don't worry about experimental verification. Physics is a science. Theory must be verified with data before you can make your mark in physics. Not one of Stephen Hawking's famous ideas can be verified. Very interesting. That today, somehow, because of the media, we have changed the standard of how to judge work. People constantly ask me about string theory, not verifiable. Why bother? It's a fib, sophistry. Mathematical, yes, but we shouldn't worry about such thing. This is the reason I reacted so badly with black hole, for which I did apologize to the lady. But the point is that the sophistry had kept the Darwinism debate in a very peculiar situation. So let's get into the sophistry a little bit to just give you a feel for it. Sophistry of creationists, I won't bother. because, as I said, they don't pretend to be scientific. The sophistry of the Darwinist is very interesting. Early on, there was clear evidence already that there are gaps in the fossil data. Darwin knew about it. He worried about it. And then by the time it was 20th century and by the time it was 1970, the paleontological data was so clear that two very famous paleontologists already established in their fields with unquestionable credential to be daring enough to suggest that Darwin's theory cannot stand. And they proposed a new theory called theory of punctuated equilibrium, where they said that clearly, let me show you a little bit of, I do have a picture of that. It'll come. There's Darwin, and there's the punctuated equilibrium. Why? Because Darwin's, this tree of life, this is, of course, from the Bible. But one of Darwin's images of wide scope is this tree of life. Repeatedly it comes up in his writing. And the explanation he gave, of course, is that the theory of adaptation they originally started with is actually theory of speciation, species change, through these genetic changes and natural selection. Those selections are chosen that eventually diverges from the species. They cannot reproductively unite anymore. And so a new species starts, and they're branching, and that's how we create this entire biological kingdoms. There's a problem, said Eldridge and Gould. Problem is that these branches are not continuous. It's a very funny tree of life, because there are gaps between the branches and the trunk, branches and little branches. Always these gaps, fossil gaps. So they suggested that there must be two tempos of evolution. One is the slow tempo that Darwin suggested. Over many millions of years, even little changes can make big changes. That was Darwin's idea. They said, well, since there is these gaps, obviously that theory is not the entire story. So there must be two tempos. One is the slow tempo, because there is enough evidence of, unbroken stuff. And little changes, that's not included in this tree of life. That can be explained by Darwinism. Little changes, little speciation, which we call micro-speciation. Speciation by little changes. And then there is this macro-speciation, large changes, like when a reptile egg bursts open and flies away. Reptile becomes bird. That kind of big changes. That we don't have the intermediates. We don't have the intermediate fossils between the last reptile and the first bird. And therefore, they said that that must be the result of a fast tempo of evolution. They did not have any mechanism for explaining the fast tempo. But it's very interesting. Gaylord Simpson, another great biologist of that time, a little bit before Eldridge and Gould, he wrote a book in which the phrase appears, quantum evolution. It's very interesting. Quantum evolution. So he knew about quantum physics. This was written like 1940. There was no need not to know quantum physics, which was discovered in 1925-26. So here is an acknowledgement also by another famous biologist that there are two tempos. And quite a few biologists of that era agreed with this idea. But then The establishment noticed it, and they gave a fib, sophistry. This is called theory of geographical isolation. So it is said that suppose there was some sort of a geological catastrophe that takes place and divides a portion of the species off from the main portion of the species. They are now geographically isolated from this main portion with which they cannot breed anymore. And because of these geological changes that isolated this new part, there of course be environmental changes in that part different from the environmental changes for the main part, and therefore they will evolve in a very different way. And because it is a small sample of species, there will be a lot of interbreeding, which produces rapid mutation. This is a well-known fact. And therefore, there will be rapid changes there to get huge macro variations. And that's why macro speciation. Very, very different than the older form of this species. So big changes, macro speciation occurs through geographical isolation. And lo and behold, in 10, 12, 15, 20 years, we find gradually that Eldredge and Gould are sort of toning down. They still talk about punctuated equilibrium, but only with friends. Publicly, they accept this geographical isolation as a plausible explanation. Is geographical isolation a possible explanation? We call it in science plausible explanation. Plausible, but the big defect, of course, is that it is not scientifically verifiable, because within the time span of human life, such geological catastrophes just don't come about. They take millions and millions of years. A not verifiable theory accepted by all biologists officially, that is, unofficially no, but officially, as explanation of why punctuated equilibrium seems to be the case. But it's really not the case, because there is an explanation after all. Now, if you read evolution theory and evolution, books on evolution, this kind of thing occurs time after time after time. Plausible explanations, which is beautifully passes over the problem, glosses over the problem, and you will never, unless you are an expert, you'll never even notice. It reads like a wonderful story, how the neck of the giraffe could develop, how other impossibilities like the primitive eye could develop from no eye, and all this is explained. So let's tell you what the problem was with the neck of the giraffe and eye. Darwin himself talked about the eye, and basically his concern still stands. And his concern was that the eye is a very, very complex organ if you start from scratch. Species that cannot see and species that have at least primitive way of seeing, because thousands and thousands of mutations are required for producing even a primitive eye. So that's the whole idea, right? Thousands of mutations are taking place over millions and millions of years, and they accumulate and produce the eye. What's wrong with that picture? Darwin knew what's wrong, because it is a fact that most mutations would not be beneficial. And the whole idea of natural selection is that beneficial mutations will be selected. Mutations that increase the fecundity, increase the fertility of the species, more progeny. But how can 1,000th of an eye be beneficial? 1,000th of an eye has no use, right? So Darwin himself knew this. He wrote it like that. So How does this problem find solution in later writing by biologists in modern textbooks? Beautiful sophistry. They say that, well, it is true that 1,000th of an eye has no beneficial use as far as seeing is concerned, but suppose there are other beneficial use for that particular mutation. Suppose it's cold climate, that particular mutation contributes heat, insulation for the creature. Is that justifiable? And then some example will be given. Examples are there. I mean, the biological kingdom is huge. You can find one or two such intermediate use and make a case for it. But the idea that thousands upon thousands of mutations could occur in that way, that is never addressed. Just that one or two justifies. In the eyes of the non-specialist, that should be enough, because non-specialist now assumes that, oh yes, this seems right. Specialist is the gap, because of course one or two does not prove that this is the case with all the mutations that will be necessary to produce the primitive eye, or this is not all the mutations that would be necessary to produce the neck of the giraffe. And if you think about it, then you get into that problem that we talked about yesterday. If you think about it, then something else emerges. And it's easy to think about it if you're researching the subject. Both the case of the eye and the neck of the giraffe, the neck, a long neck, is not just about a long neck. As soon as I have said it, you see the problem, right? Because the neck has to be supported, so the bone structure also has to change. It's not just mutation of the neck. It's not a localized mutation. It's mutation of elsewhere in the body. The heart has to change. Blood supply, blood pressure has to be produced to supply the brain with blood, right? So other organs are involved at different parts of the body. What does that remind you from yesterday's quantum talk? Non-locality. Non-locality. How do two places of the body communicate? How does the body know? Non-locality. So Darwinian mechanism, which is strictly Newtonian, local mutations, local changes, just cannot cover, even in principle, the non-local changes that are needed for evolving things like the neck of the giraffe. Making sense? Yeah, please.
I don't know if this is correlating, but they said the DNA in a butterfly, the wings of the butterfly are actually in the caterpillar. And until they go through that process of metamorphosis, that's when the DNA is activated and the wings come out. Now, is it possible that the eye was always in the person, or the neck of the giraffe was always in the giraffe, and that through natural selection that DNA was activated?
Okay. No, but this is an ideal, this is what I mean. Biologists, this is what I mean by the sophistry, that it's already in the DNA. Okay, what is in the DNA? Think about it. This is the hardest part to penetrate for a non-biologist. This book took me literally from mid-90s to 2008 to finish. And the reason is that I was not a biologist. It's very difficult to penetrate these things. Fortunately, there are other biologists too who know that this kind of argument just doesn't work. What is a gene? You know that already, right? Genes are instructions to make proteins. Instruction to make proteins. Listen carefully. Not instructions to make form. not instructions to make butterfly wings, just to make the proteins that contributes to butterfly wing. Agreed, protein is the functional component of every form that we have, but not the form. The assumption is that there are only the genes, and genes must have. This assumption is what drives scientific materialism, because there is no other alternative. They're positing there is nothing but matter. Therefore, in the case of biology, the assumption is there is nothing but genes. Therefore, everything must come from the genes. Somehow. That somehow is never explained. This is why Rupert Sheldrake invented morphogenetic fields to explain form. Brian Goodwin gave even more detail how form building occurs even in the physical part. Genes are just not enough. Cellular interactions have to be put in. Environmental interactions have to be included in form building. Okay? But for a non-specialist, it's very tough to catch biological sophistry. So sophistry after sophistry holds up Darwin's theory. Mainly, there are just two pieces of data, actually three, but the third is a little more complex, so I won't go into it. Actually, there are many others too, but they're not as big. So this is one. And the second one is even more poignant from our point of view, because the second one is the idea that there is a progression in this evolution of species. Indeed, species becomes more complex, simple to complex. This is amazing, that biologists never talk about it. You know how I found this out? Because the physicist wrote an article about biological arrow of time in Scientific American. Because I read Scientific American from God knows when, I knew about biological arrow of time from the work of a physicist.
Biological what?
Arrow of time.
Oh, arrow.
You can tell the past by looking at the past data. The fossils are simple, future fossils are complex. Even a child can do it. In fact, children ask this kind of question if you take them to the Smithsonian Institution and show them the fossil record. Immediately, this is interesting. Why is that? If the child is intelligent, already a child will ask, but Darwin's theory says otherwise. How can that be correct? It cannot be. Darwin's theory is based on gene mutation, chance. Chance has no direction. Natural selection depends on fecundity, not on complexity. Whether you are more fertile or not does not depend on whether you are complex or not, right? Bacteria are much more fertile than human beings. So this is the thing. In science, when I was taught science anyway, my teachers continuously emphasized one thing. Look, Amit, never concentrate on the data that is commonplace. Always concentrate on data that is exception, because that's what leads to new theory. Data that cannot be explained with the commonplace ideas that are already prevalent. Now, why is it that biologists don't focus on the arrow of time, which does not obviously agree with Darwinism, but clearly the data is showing it? Why don't they concentrate on this fast tempo of evolution? By the way, why fast? Because if it is fast, then there is no time to lay down fossils. And therefore, the gaps are explained immediately. So then comes the idea that, well, is there alternative way of explaining evolution, which will explain tempo, which will bring in purposiveness? This agreed. Now I will present the other side of it. Agreed that if you're a biologist, it would be a very hard thing to do at this point. Within biology, what kind of idea came? And they're actually neat ideas. One fellow, Goldschmidt, he pointed out that maybe what happens is that a whole bunch of very strange mutations take place that do happen sometimes. We go to a fair and person with a 6 toe or, person with 2 heads, they do show up and they make money showing such creatures. So why not such abnormalities just somehow get fixed in the population? So that's one idea. It tells you that sort of thing. It reminds you of creativity. Of course, biologists wouldn't accept it, but that was an idea that was proposed seriously, and because it was a famous biologist, it was published. The other idea that stands out, again, brilliant idea within the, if you're a biologist, what to do kind of attitude. This is the idea of neutral genes. Maybe some genes are not selected upon. This is a very interesting idea. Suppose some genes are not selected upon. They are neutral with respect to selection, neither negative nor positive. So they are just not, they're just benign genes. This gave us a clue. They gave me a clue at least. Now, of course, I had a good reason to look at biological evolution. The reason is that if there is a new science, new paradigm of science, then that paradigm should explain things that could not be explained in the paradigm before. And also every important aspect of nature must be now explained on the basis of consciousness. Consciousness is the ground of being, so evolution must be evolution of consciousness. Fortunately, there was already a theory of evolution of consciousness. Okay, this is a theory that was given by Sri Aurobindo and Teilhard de Chardin. Very beautiful theory, and it says that evolution is evolution of consciousness. It also says that evolution must be preceded by what is called involution. Involution means what? They explained, progressively consciousness forgets. A little bit difficult non-scientific language because philosophers are writing it, okay? So the idea of forgetfulness is introduced, that consciousness becomes unconscious of that particular possibilities. Doesn't use the word possibility either. It's a little bit obtuse, but forgets its own aspects and progressively forgets until it totally forgets. That's matter. And then matter evolves to bring back what was forgotten. So evolution is progressive manifestation of those things that were involuted in the first place. Making sense? You were asleep. Progressively you were sleeping and you were forgetting stuff. Then you are wakeful. Progressively you start remembering what you forgot. That's basically the idea. Okay? Now the job for you is to change this into scientific language. How do you do it? Quantum physics makes it very easy. This is why I found that quantum physics really is just so approachable a language. You're laughing because quantum physics sounds so complex, but it isn't really. What is the thinking? Thinking is in terms of possibility. So initially, what is the primordial condition of reality? Easy, right? All possibilities, consciousness and every possibility. Think about this state for a while. Every possibility included. What does that mean? Only one thing, past, present, future, everything is already there. Ecclesiastes, it's in the Bible. Because biblical scholars are also great philosophers. That's got to be the primordial state. And what is that primordial state? Nothing changes. Everything is already included. Nothing can happen. This is why it is called eternity. Reality must be eternity. Isn't that just beautiful? You know, one of the criticisms that you all find about cosmology, modern cosmology, is of course that it never stops you from asking the question, what was before the Big Bang? What was before inflation? What was before whatever you propose? There's just no end to this question. But if you say that reality is eternity, do you see that the question ends? What was before eternity, you cannot ask. There was no before and there is no after. So the philosopher says one very beautiful thing. Everything now is just going to be appearance. They are great philosophers. They really know how to construct reality, because reality has to be eternity and then nothing can happen. So how do you make things happen? You have to forget some of the possibilities. You have to allow for some ignorance and then gradually recover what you forgot. Beautiful idea, involution. So the first stage of involution is, of course, to play the game within laws, so only choose those possibilities which are lawful, including quantum laws. This is the supramental. They are imposing a limitation, forgetfulness. Second limitation, only those possibilities which are meaningful. Mind, right? Mind processes meaning. That's how the idea is born. Third, possibilities of only specific biological forms, biological templates. Those blueprints, morphogenetic field, Sheldrake version, vital body. Next, the physical. What does the physical do? Physical makes representations. Physical can make images, maps of all this previous stuff. Physical makes maps initially of the forms, biological morphogenetic fields, the blueprints of forms, and then brain develops, brain makes representation of the mind, meaning, and then eventually we shall make representations of even the values. You heard Theosophists are not particularly embarrassed talking about devas in terms of they really existed in flesh and blood. That's the idea. There is the arupa deva which are formless, and there is also the concept of rupa deva, devas which are born in form. And that's the idea of supramental being represented in flesh. Okay? So it clearly gives you a direction of evolution. The first part has already taken place with the evolution of the brain, and then other parts are still in progress. We are in the mental evolution part. So where does quantum physics come in? Quantum physics now can fill in the gaps. Why this theory is more plausible than Darwinian theory. If quantum physics can explain how the second tempo occurs, if quantum theory can explain how the arrow of time finds a natural description, which this philosophy is already giving you, so all quantum physics has to do is to adapt itself to the particular language, right? So the big explanation is really the explanation of punctuated equilibrium, explanation of the fact that these gaps that we are seeing are really fast tempo, in fact, instant tempo, quantum leap. They are examples of quantum leap. They are examples of creativity in evolution. Evolution is creative. Evolution is also a continuous part of it, very much like Darwinian. But then there is this creative evolution. That's what produces macro speciation. That's what produces the big changes. Okay, so what is the one big thing then to be explained? Why do we need these quantum leaps? Why do we need creativity for this? This is where that go back to that, what we discussed, the difficulty with producing the primitive eye or neck of the giraffe in Darwinism. Many, many mutations are involved. Bring up the concept of neutral genes. What is the idea saying? The idea is saying we don't need to be explicitly choose. We don't want to invoke choice. Big assumption of the materialist is always what? Consciousness is not needed. Big assumption of quantum physics got to be what? That consciousness needed to get manifestation. Without that conscious choice, manifestation does not occur. So the first thing first, which is that in 1981, a physicist again wrote a paper published in Biological Journal, because this physicist was a very famous physicist named Althusser, Walter Althusser, and his ideas were sound. Ideas were that, look, gene is just a molecule, portion of a molecule. What is a mutation of a gene? It's at the molecular level. It's at a quantum level. They're really quantum processes. All hell should have been broken loose, but it didn't, because Althusser was working on a different problem. His problem was heterogeneity. That's a different story. It is an important part of the story, but I don't have time to get into it, so I won't. Heterogeneity is something also a huge problem for biology. How does heterogeneity come? Because biology is about homogeneous. Everybody should be the same, because, unless the genes are different. But people have similar genes, but they're very different. How does that heterogeneity take place? That was the problem that Althusser was working with. But the idea that gene mutations are quantum possibilities, that idea, of course, strikes in your mind if you're looking for a solution of this problem of fast tempo of evolution, and I was. So the first hurdle was clear. There is quantum involved. The biologist is always making the assumption, like all scientific materialists, that collapse occurs anyway. Somehow, the possibilities become actuality. But suppose you say that, no, they can't, because consciousness is not involved. Why isn't consciousness involved yet? Because it's not making anything yet. There is no purpose to be served in collapsing these superpositions of possibilities, because there is no organ yet. There is no function to be performed. You see what I'm saying? So possible mutations can collect. Possibilities are not collapsing because they are not making anything meaningful. They are not representing a morphogenetic field as of yet. Only when the entire collection is complete. And some of it may be contradictory. Remember our discussion yesterday? Conflicts are okay because opposites can be processed in the unconscious. So similarly, all kinds of mutations, irrespective of when they are going to occur, can all simultaneously be considered in possibility, processed in possibility. And then collapse occurs when consciousness sees the gestalt that produces that needed form. See how non-locality can be included? Because in possibility, we don't need to have locality. Quantum physics permits non-locality anyway. Consciousness is non-local. Therefore, the bone structures can change, all this stuff that a long neck requires, circulation and all that, that can simultaneously change in possibility. And all these genes wait there until the entire gestalt is ready for consciousness to discover. Creative quantum leap. That's the quantum answer. So in this way, once you have explained this, one question remains. And this is also a very important question. So whose consciousness? In the case of human creativity, it's the creativity of the individual that does play a role. Of course, it is also cosmic consciousness, but it's a play of the individual with the cosmos. That's what is giving us creativity. Anybody who has been creative knows this. This is why we feel such joy of flow experience. What is the corresponding thing in the biological case? Obviously, individuals are not very much involved. That's clear. Individuals, especially in the primitive biological eras, the individuals are not just smart enough to think about them in a. And it's just very difficult to think of a creative amoeba. But amoeba as a species is a different story. And this is the thing. Again, biologists within their own biological thinking, they don't have quantum physics to help them. They don't have primacy of consciousness to help them. Have suggested this already, that the selection is a species selection. Nature selects on the basis not of individual, but the entire species. It's a species selection that takes place. So again, that's a hint. So species consciousness, sometimes it's the genus consciousness, sometimes the consciousness of even bigger. The entire phylum is involved, that phylum consciousness. Sometimes it's the Gaia consciousness, the entire kingdom is involved. Depending on how big a macroevolutionary step that we are talking about. You see how a very big consciousness and therefore a very big intelligence can be involved in biological evolution. Indeed, when the first bird is being produced from the last reptile, it does not have to be just the new class that is involved, but instead the entire big enchilada of consciousness, the entire Gaia consciousness could be involved, because this has to do with, much to do with the purposiveness of evolution itself. So in this way, all of these ideas fit in. And for the details, of course, I will refer you to Creative Evolution book, because we don't have time for it. I want to move on to the next subject, which is that, okay, so we have the progression, we have the arrow of time. First, the morphogenetic fields are manifested progressively. So initially we have just the three low chakras: reproduction and anabolism, catabolism. So first three chakras develop organs connected with reproduction, connected with metabolism. Elimination organs, root chakra, sex chakra, ego chakra, maintenance chakra. And then higher chakras. Higher chakras corresponding to higher functions. I never understood quite how the heart chakra has both the immune system and the heart as well. But the role of the heart is a little bit was a little bit mysterious to me until I heard yesterday's lecture. It became clear. Thank you. Heart chakra then does not have so much to do with love. The heart, the organ heart, does not have so much to do with love, but it has much to do with intuition. That is what basically you are saying, because it goes directly, it gives the input to the amygdala. So it's the sixth chakra that the physical heart is more connected with. But these are all details. The point I'm making is that one after the other, the biological blueprints, morphogenetic fields, they are represented in the physical body in the form of organs. If you look at the chakras, you will get a pretty good description of the progression of these things. Okay. So the brain develops, neocortex develops, and now mental meaning can be represented. Big, big, big step. Mental meaning can be represented. So we have progression of how. What does the mind do? The first step of the evolution of the mind would be mind looks at the most obvious of everything, sensory data, the external world. Mind gives meaning to physical. Mind gives meaning to the physical world. Physical mind, that's Aurobindo's term. Physical mind. Hunters and gatherers, say the anthropologists. This part is not part of Darwinism, but anthropologists do this anyway. A little bit violation of Darwin. According to Darwinism, there is no meaning to evolution of the mind. Mind does not exist separately from the brain. Darwinists cannot talk about evolution of the mind. But anthropologists do actually talk about this. They have these hunters and gatherers, and they're interested in horticulture, agriculture. So Aurobindo says, well, hunters and gatherers is the physical mind. That's pretty obvious. You need to pay attention to the physical world when you are a hunter or a gatherer. But then horticulture, small-scale agriculture, like using a hoe. This is the vital mind. Mind studying the nature of vital energy movements. Now here I could go into lots of interesting stuff. It is really, really very interesting. This is the age that sometimes is called the golden age by especially feminine anthropologists for a very good reason. Because women could do small-scale agriculture. There was no need for segregation among humans, segregation with respect to sex. And this was the golden age. Why? Because men and women worked together. They worked together in relationships, studying emotions. That's when we developed from the ancient animal instincts of pure feelings, for which you admire animals, into emotions, correlated neocortical circuits and brain circuits in the hindbrain, limbic brain. Correlated feeling circuits and meaning circuits together, meanings that are given to feelings, emotions in other words. Human beings have emotions, animals instinctual feelings. This is why animal feelings we often admire how pure they are. A lion, when it's not hungry, will play with a deer, not hunt it. It has no sense of killing and preserving for the future. It doesn't do that. But human beings would hunt for the future. Thinking. Thinking has gone into the picture. So in this way, the horticultural era has much evidence for equality between men and women. Goddesses appear, both gods and goddesses. So obviously, men are worshipping women, clearly. The best depiction of pictures of this era is, of course, Kali standing on the body of Shiva. By the way, I heard this story about Nelson Mandela, very, very touching story. Mandela goes to Calcutta, and he likes the city. So journalists ask, why do you like this city so much? And he says, well, this is the only city where I've seen this wonderful picture of a black woman standing on the body of a white man. So that's from this era. And then we come to agriculture, large-scale agriculture, and immediately sexual segregation takes place and hell breaks loose. We don't finish the job of producing the positive emotional brain circuits or positive emotional instincts, and that, of course, has become now the primary problem. Have we finished making all representations of mental meaning, reasoning, the mental age, as it is called? No, we haven't. We haven't because we are stuck. We are stuck in the sense that we have not integrated the feelings, higher feelings, and thinking. We have not made these positive emotional brain circuits. This is the big task. Because the next age, we went through giving meaning to physical, giving meaning to vital, giving meaning to mental meaning itself, meaning of meaning. That's the third stage of evolution that we are in. Fourth stage. What is left? Giving meaning to the supramental. Remember, there are four experiences: sensing, physical, feeling, vital, thinking, mental, and then intuiting the archetypal. The mind should give meaning to intuition. Mind should give meaning to love, beauty, justice, truth, those archetypes. We have started it. We've started it with Moses. We started with Pythagoras and Plato and Socrates. We started with Buddha and Upanishads. But have we finished? No, far from it. We haven't finished. We cannot finish. We cannot finish because we are too stuck with negative emotions. Unless we complement our negative emotional brain circuits, these instincts, with positive emotional brain circuit, the way we have emphasized in this conference, to my delight. This is the emphasis of every conference on consciousness, has to be. This is our task. We have to do it. But how does it happen? How do we do it? This is the big question. Now here, something very important has to happen. I'll go over a little bit. Will that be okay?
Sorry.
It's all right? Okay. So I have to take a break from evolution now and go into another aspect which every theosophist appreciates, because it's part and parcel, very important to understand. This aspect is reincarnation. This is part of theosophy also. Madame Blavatsky really was just a genius in terms of writing the important ingredients of the secret doctrine. It's all there. The idea of evolution is there. The idea of consciousness is the ground of being. She starts with that. And she puts in very early on the idea of reincarnation, which is fundamentally important idea of human creativity. The point is that the development of brain circuits of positive emotion takes the creative discovery of stuff like love, beauty, justice, and then living it, manifesting it in my behavior, right? It requires creativity in all four stages, the insight and then manifestation, developing the actual circuit by behaving according to the insight. Insight will not do, but your behavior must be changed to get that instant easy without effort. That comes only when we have a brain circuit available for it. Now here is why reincarnation comes in, and we realize that reincarnational history is very important for creativity. Notice that there are very, very large spectrum of creative people. What are all these creative people doing? If you look at some creative people, they are very primitive in their creativity. Creativity is there. Everybody has the potential to be creative. But why is the creativity very primitive in some people? Why is it so botched up in terms of emotions? A Van Gogh is obviously not creative like Buddha or Jesus, but very demented in some ways. Creativity is great. We can enjoy it. But certainly there is no question that he's also a little bit crazy. So the creativity expresses itself at different levels. The unconscious processing, as Freud knew, unconscious processing is different. For Van Gogh, the unconscious processing is pretty close to the processing of a neurotic. So his pictures have neurosis in it, great pictures, but neurotic. Whereas if you take a person like Rabindranath Tagore, a Bengali poet who was also a musician, a novelist, and an artist, and a real great genius. And he was also a mystic. This entire spectrum of creativity. What produces a Rabindranath Tagore? What produces a Tagore is that many more incarnations have taken place. So sexuality, which is haunting Van Gogh, is not haunting Tagore. His unconscious is much purified. Theosophists in general, notice this please, have less sexuality and more of higher feelings of love. Why is that? Because you are old souls. You are old souls. New souls will be tormented by their sexual instincts. This is why Freud talks about it. But look at the difference between Freud and Jung, his disciple. Jung doesn't talk about sexuality because he didn't have it. He didn't have such drives. He really did not have much of sexual drive. He really didn't. That's why he could go into mysticism. He had some. I'm not saying he didn't have any. But I did meet one person, Franklin Barrel Wolf, who just didn't have it. He told me that he just was curious once, and so he had sex only once in his life. And he didn't like it so. Now, for such people, the unconscious processing is different. And conscious processing just does not have the lower chakra stuff involved. So different things can be expressed, different expressions. Not outer creativity, but inner creativity becomes possible. So if you are engaged in inner creativity, consider yourself an old soul. That's the answer. So that's the first thing, that we need reincarnation to understand this next step of evolutionary necessity. What is the other criterion? Obviously, the olden days made one very serious mistake. Some of the teachers, not all teachers. Buddha did not make this mistake. He was very clear. If you read Buddhism, you find that Buddha doesn't want the Buddhism to be pursued by everybody. He knows that only a few people can do it. It's very clear. He was very reluctant to even teach householders. And then he reluctantly gave in and said that, okay, I'll make some exceptions. Why is that? Because again, that old soul requirement is very clear. The ordinary people's unconscious just doesn't cooperate. Just too much garbage in it. So whatever you can process only limited stuff in terms of what is needed for transformation. But then we are stuck. If only a few people can be creative, how do we make changes in entire humanity? And the big good news, first intuited by Rupert Sheldrake in the 80s, and the idea is that only a few people are needed to make changes. Only a few people are needed. This was discovered early on. You find it in Buddhism. There is a story that only 5 people came to a village, not even people, one person and 4 animals. They came to, it's an allegory, came to a village, and because they were so peaceful and meditative, the entire village became peaceful and meditative. So, Rupert Sheldrake says, this can work. How? So to make this story complete, I began this story of evolution mentioning Lamarck. So let's bring back Lamarck. Acquired characteristic. can acquired characteristics play a role? Because remember a few people, right? We are part of a few people. How many theosophists are there in the world? 15,000, maybe 20,000, right? But how many total quantum activism-oriented people are there in the world? My guess is, well, about 5 million people saw what they believe and got excited. So I think 5 million is a good number. These people are ready. They saw something that other people didn't. So they saw the potency of creativity. That's what you need to see, the potency of creativity. If you see the potency of creativity today, we have the mechanism, we have the understanding for you to be creative. It's not difficult. If we know the steps to do it, we can do it. But how does 5 million people, their work, you learn to love? You have a brain circuit. Compassion comes to you naturally. How can that brain circuit get into somebody else? If the prejudice is that only genes can do it, it's not going to happen. It's not going to get into the genes. It takes long, long, long time to hope that somehow genes will give the right change, which will produce eventually a brain circuit from the genetic composition, genetic makeup of the person. So Sheldrake's idea was, of course, these morphogenetic fields. His idea is that if you make a brain circuit, you're not only changing the brain, but you're also changing the morphogenetic field associated with the brain. See that? Yes? They're correlated. And then reincarnation is what? Reincarnation is you are born with these modifications of your behavior. What we call karma are nothing but modifications of behavior. This is what quantum physics tells us. Modifications of behavior, mathematical modifications of behavior that are contained in mathematical equation, in Akasha, non-local memory. There is evidence for it, folks. Really, there's good evidence for that memory is non-local. Memory of patterns of habit, memory of what we learn is non-local. If we learn about love and make a brain circuit of it, it's non-locally contained in the modified equation of movement, quantum equation of movement that governs that behavior of that morphogenetic field. And therefore, if somebody in the future uses that modified equation of the morphogenetic field, he or she is using your product of your work, your lifelong work of developing that circuit. See the enormity of Rupert Sheldrake's idea put in the quantum language? Also Lamarckian. This is what Lamarck said. We just didn't understand him, that's all. We did not have concepts of reincarnation. We did not have concepts of morphogenetic field, so we didn't understand him. Now we are understanding him, all right?
Is that morphogenetic resonance?
That's morphic resonance. What Sheldrake's idea was morphic resonance. We don't call it morphic resonance. We will call it consciousness choosing. That's similar ideas. The details, it would take too much time to go into the details. All right, but still one more problem, which is that how does it get into the main population? The incarnation is still 1 to 1 to 1 to 1, right? And here is where the additional idea that if this learning and producing brain circuit is done in groups. Go back to the horticultural era. In that time, could it be, this is Sheldrake. Sheldrake himself speculates, that could it be that this is how we develop the instincts? This is how we build these negative emotional brain circuits that we are tormented by today. Isn't that got to be how? Because Darwinism has no answer, genes have no answers. Evolution itself has no answers for this particular part, because evolution, in the way even quantum evolution we have built, it just talks about gene mutations. We got to have some explanation of these instincts. There is no explanation in the form of genetic. So Sheldrake suggested that maybe what happened in that era is that people were much more oriented in working with groups. Indeed, tribal society. And the vital energies are much more non-local. You notice that if you translate Rollins' talk a little bit towards our thinking, he was strictly being a scientist, of course, and not talking about vital energies and stuff. But if we include that, what happens? All that he was talking about is actually non-locality of vital energies. This non-locality of vital energies is pervasive. It's very easy to correlate together in vital energies. Those data that he showed with random number generators, which are very easy to do, that shows clearly that if you are emoting in love in a room full of people, then random number generators go bizarre and start behaving away from randomness just routinely. How they do it? Because you have become connected to that collective consciousness, quantum consciousness, and have open to creativity and non-locality. That's what it's indicating. Opposite of randomness is choice. You have started choosing. You have started choosing the good stuff. And so if we do it together, we could do it. We could do it together, learn to love each other in a group. And here is why I love Theosophical Society, because you are already a group. You have been a group for more than 100 years now. What's your excuse of not loving each other together? So make every conference, make every gathering of a group a loving exercise of enjoying each other's love and developing these brain circuits, make the morphogenetic field collective and non-local. When that happens, says Sheldrake, and I completely agree with him, quantum physics agrees with him because of this concept of non-locality, then this reincarnational capacity, the propagation of the morphogenetic field from one genre to another, one generation to another, will become a group thing. In the literature, there is already a reference to group soul. I don't know if you have read that, but Madame Blavatsky talks about it.
Jane Roberts.
Yeah, that too. Jane Roberts too. Group soul, this concept of group soul. I talked about species consciousness, concept of species consciousness, the entire consciousness of human species, that will become involved. And that does not require the entire species. Only a few people can arouse that consciousness. All we have to do is to resonate with a bigger consciousness, bigger than our individual consciousness, to make such a big change. Can we do it? Yes, we can do it. We can do it through programs that Rollin talked about yesterday. We can do it through these global positioning systems of positioning various instruments and let them help us become coherent with each other. We can do it by intuiting. We can do it by taking facility not only in our heart chakra, but also with the physical heart, and getting the sixth chakra involved with it, by intuiting together. And if we do it, then 6 generations from now, babies will be born with a love circuit in their brain.